Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and right now we're looking at Narci Fable Singer Saga. This deck comes to us from Lexa, who has been so gracious to once again support the channel to bring their deck to the front of the queue. Thank you so much, Lexa. It is always a pleasure to see your decks and to work on them. They say, let me get their comments out on the deck. They say this is the first draft of a brand new commander. It's laid out with all synergy stuff, so now it's at the point of finding stuff to cut for interaction. And they say it's going to be proxied, so no real restriction, but I have a vendetta against off-color fetches. Absolutely. We'll see what we can cut out. But first, I will have some additions I'd like to go through, and some ideas, quite a few actually now that I'm looking at it. But then we will definitely look for cuts for interaction. As always, if you'd like to send me your own deck so that I can make a video on it, there is a link in the video description below. And if, like Lexa, you'd like your video to be the next one I make, well, there's a link down there so that you can get that done, support the channel, and bring your deck list to the front of the queue. Also, while you're down there, you can see the complete deck list we'll be looking at today, and I highly recommend you take a look at it. Narci is a new commander, so when we're trying to figure out a way to build her, it is always helpful to have a deck list in mind. That isn't just the pre-constructed deck list, of course. So let's start where we always do by looking at the commander and what they do. Narci Fable Singer is a 4-mana human bard in Abzan colors, that's white, black, green, a 3/3 lifelink creature. She says whenever you sacrifice an enchantment, draw a card, and then whenever the final ability of a saga you control resolves, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is that saga's mana value. Now, that adds up, I think, faster than one would think. Maybe not so much with the maybe the 2-drop sagas. You'll be more happy about drawing a card than you will be about the life drain. But especially with sagas that are 4 or 5 mana, that are already doing a lot, adding the final text of, you know, each opponent loses 5 life and you draw a card, you know, that makes it like a better Kakusho, right? Well, maybe that's not an ideal comparison, but a better drain spell of the new kind of drain spells where you only gain the same amount each opponent loses as opposed to the total. But still, that's a pretty good line of text, especially with our better sagas. And I generally like her. I like the art. I love the flavor of this being on Theros, and I love the Abzan colors for enchantments. I do like the direction they're going here. So that in mind, we can see here the deck list is pretty much set up. We have one instant here, which I think is the hint that of what Lexa said of wanting to make room and cuts for interaction. Now, I actually don't have a lot to say about interaction because I think the regular suite is already... Maybe I'll go in a quick version in a bit, but I still like to go over some additions before we look at cuts, because there's a chance that I'm going to, you know, suggest too much, and so I would like the ideas out there before we get any further. So in no particular order, let's go through some cards that I think I would like in a Narci deck, and then we'll look at the deck itself. And these cards are cards that I just think are generally missing or are options that we could be putting in here. I think the most notable one is Doomwake Giant. Doomwake Giant drains on constellation triggers on an opponent. And I think even for a deck that might just play 1 or 2 enchantments a turn, this is very much so worthwhile. The ceiling of this ability is very, very high, but the floor is pretty good too. I think of a lot of board states where opponents will still have X1s on their side, like a Dark Confidant, a Thalia, a Esper Sentinel, Mana Dorks. There's just a lot of targets that even one trigger of Doomwake Giant will be particularly satisfying with. It also can set up certain situations where you can get more profitable attacks through, and even better, with certain flicker or flash enchantments or tricks that way, you can do this on your opponent's turn, which I think is particularly strong as well. So this is something worth considering. Another card that's worth considering that I feel is notably missing is Sun Titan. For a deck that is really keen on having your enchantments sacrificed and generally having, you know, a large swath of 3 mana and lower enchantments, Sun Titan feels like a really easy inclusion to get some recursion going on. Now, I have a second, let's just go to the second option right away, but this is considerably cheaper. And you might have guessed that the second option is Anekthea, who is the other commander from this precon, which is apparently $2 now? Interesting. I tried to buy it for her from my LGS, and she was listed at, you know, $40+ because no one no one here is buying the pre-constructed. So if you're buying it online, perhaps it's not that hard. You might have to track it down, but you know what I did? And here's my little life hack, because if I'm going to build Anekthea, I'm going to make her my commander. I bought that little cardboard insert that comes with commander decks these days. So she was 20 cents. And I thought that was a pretty reasonable cost for a commander that I would play as my commander. But if you are proxying this deck, Anekthea might be better than Sun Titan, as she brings any enchantment back to the battlefield. Now granted, it does make them into creatures, which may or may not be, you know, ideal, but also, like, it will make, it doesn't say non-creature enchantment, it actually says non-aura, which is really, really weird, right? Traditionally, this kind of effect usually can't, because it's animating the enchantment, can't make enchantment creatures, but, you know, if you have Nyxbloom Colossus, which is something I'm going to suggest in a bit, this is really, really good because you're happy to reanimate it even if you lose it permanently as a 3/3. I think this is particularly good. I think her power and toughness are a little weak, but she does have Titan stats, you know, that her ability triggers on ETB and attack, which is really, really good. So I think either Sun Titan or Anekthea, which I personally like her a little more. Then, once again, going back in no particular order, Seal of Cleansing and Seal of Primordium. Which, yeah, this is the color shifted one. I don't know if I would play both, but I would definitely consider at least one. These cards are really, really good. You get to proactively play them, triggering any form of, what would we call them? Any form of Enchantress effect or Constellation effect, or just being around for a few of your cards. So that's really good. And then you can kind of keep them there as a threat. And then, of course, when you sacrifice them with Narci out on the battlefield, you will get a card draw from them, which I think is really, really good. Maybe it's just a slight advantage, like you're going up a card when you're 1-for-1 your opponent, but this deck has so much synergy with these kind of things that I think you're going to be pretty happy with the trade. Now, this might take a bit away from your instant, you know, interaction, but I think they are both worth considering because the floor isn't bad and the ceiling is just really, really high because you can just play this out and wait for an opponent to, you know, before, like, they'll cast a what do you call it, Rhystic Study or Smothering Tithe because they have nothing else to do, and you'll have this to take care of it. Or even better, if you ask me, you can just cast this after the fact because it'll just be a sorcery speed, you know, naturalize effect if you cast it and then use it right away. I'm going to come back to this one a little later, but first let's look at Resurgent Belief. This is something I think is noticeably absent in a deck that is a enchantment-based graveyard deck. A graveyard-based enchantment deck. I don't know which order to say that, but I think this is rather good. It's a little clunky, but the ceiling is really, really high on this card, and I think, you know, 2 mana to suspend it is pretty good, so you'll be pretty happy most of the time. Mentioned before is Nyxbloom Ancient. This is a bit of a pricey card, but if you're proxying it, I don't see a reason why you couldn't play this. You'll be really happy either playing this fairly, reanimating it, cheating into play, whatever it is, getting triple mana is really, really good. Let's see, looking at cards that are expensive, Replenish is very much so, and I want to make sure you didn't think of Replenish because I feel like that's, nope. Replenish is a rather expensive card at $80+ on the reserve list, but if you're proxying the deck, you'd be really happy to just cast this and reanimate all of your enchantments. Or if you want something that's a little more targeted, you can use Savine's Reclamation, which can get you cards twice. Or something that's like this, but just a little different, is Cosmic Rebirth. Cosmic Rebirth will return a card to your hand, but if it's 3 mana or less, it will go onto the battlefield. It has to be a permanent, sorry. And then you gain 3 life. I think an instant speed reanimation of a Saga is particularly good in this deck, and you won't be too unhappy to do it. I will say also, at sometimes you'll be happy to just put the card into your hand. I think this card is a lot better than it seems to be, and should be considered as a very strong card. Another instant speed interaction card that I thought could be played in this, but is definitely one of the weaker ones, is Flicker of Fate, because it allows you to blink an enchantment, which works particularly well with certain sagas, but can also protect your creatures, your commander, a creature, enchantment creature, things like that, and you'll be pretty happy with the results. Next, I thought of Hall of Helioid's Generosity. This should just be in there. I don't think you need to make a cut for this. I mean, you do, but just like one of your lands. I think you'll be pretty happy with this ability, especially in weird situations where you can play Seal of Primordium, sacrifice it, put the Narci trigger on the stack, use Hall of Helioid's Generosity to put it on top of your deck, and then draw it. That might not be the best play, but it's a pretty funny play. And you could do that as long as you have mana over and over again between your turns, but you could also do it on much more powerful sagas or other abilities to get the cards you want over and over again. So definitely play this card. Let's see what's left. A few proliferate cards. Unnatural Restoration puts a permanent into your hand from your graveyard, and then you proliferate. And Thirsting Roots, which I think is definitely stronger and worth considering because it can get you a basic or just proliferate. Proliferation is really, really good in Saga decks, especially in a Narci deck where you want them to trigger as fast as possible so that you can get the ability, the card, and the drain all at once before Narci, gets removed off the battlefield. The last one that I thought was worth mentioning is Vraska Betrayal Sting as a general proliferate, Planeswalkers, but I'm going to be honest, I'm not really a fan of her, so I'll leave that up to you to decide. The last thing I want to say, and we're going to maybe come back to it. No, let's do it now. Oratog is really, really interesting to me. I think with Narci, there's 2 kinds of builds. I think the first build is that you just kind of lean into the Saga play and play her as intended. Or the alternative is you built this kind of strange reanimation enchantment aristocrat decks using cards like Oratog that can sacrifice the enchantments at instant speed, and so that you can loop enchantments around using things like Replenish or things like Resurgent Belief to keep getting them back, while using the sacrifice outlets with Narci to continuously get advantage from them. I don't know how feasible that is. I'm not suggesting it, but it's on my mind. One of the things that I think holds back Narci is that she doesn't say when a saga is sacrificed, she says the final chapter ability of a saga, which I know that's on purpose. I know they did this so that I couldn't have my fun. But I don't think they needed to do this. If you were going to make an infinite sacrifice chain with any saga and Narci, I think that's hard enough to do that it should work. So I'm not quite sure why they were so keen on not letting us do it. Either way, I think it's fine. I will say something I'm thinking right now. Let's see in here if you're playing. Let's suggest one more card. Let's suggest... What is the card? Power Conduit. Now, I could be wrong here, but Power Conduit, when used with a saga, allows you to remove a saga counter, right? One of the... What are they actually called? I should actually know this. Lore counters. I play Urza Saga all the time, and I don't even know what the counters are called. So you can remove a lore counter, right? And that'll make it so even if the final chapter is triggering, you will still keep the saga. But the final chapter still triggers, right? So correct me, internet, if I'm wrong, but the idea is that if you have chapter 3 on a 3-chapter saga on the stack, then you remove a counter, so the saga is not going to be sacrificed because it's going to run out of chapters. You've still resolved the final chapter ability, right? So with that in mind, you can use this to repeatedly not only get the final chapter ability, but also to get her drain turn after turn. If that's true, which I think it is, I think this is a very, very good inclusion that you can make into your deck, and a very, very strong one. Okay, so those are all the cards that I think you could really use. Some are definitely stronger than others. I would probably really lean towards Doomwake Giant, either Sun Titan or Anixia, for sure Replenish, for sure Nyxbloom Ancient, at least one of the seals, Resurgent Belief maybe, definitely Hall of Helioid's Generosity, and then I think Thirsting Roots, considering how few lands you're playing. But Power Conduit, if it works the way I think it does, absolutely play this card. This card is going to be really, really good with Narci. So with that out of the way, as we've gone a little backwards, let's go a little forwards and let's look at cards that we can definitely cut in this deck. And a few come to mind to me. So one of them I think for me is, let's see, the Vessel of Narci, which is funny because it has our commander's name in it almost, but I think this is a little clunky. Even with the draw, I want you to imagine a spell that is 3 mana, 1 and 2 green, sorcery speed, that says, reveal the top 4 cards of your library. You may put an artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker into your hand, mill the rest, and then draw a card. Actually, technically you draw the card first, but would you play that? I don't know if I would, right? It's kind of a weird card. I think it's close. I think the fact is generally you're going to want to play this, like the fact that you section the mana out into, actually I should click this so we can see it a bit better. The fact that we section this out into 2 parts makes this a lot better, but even then, I don't know if late game you really want to cast this. I think it's close. I think I'm generally unimpressed by this card and probably would prefer just to play, you know, Read the Bones for this kind of ability, even if it's off theme. But I think it's close. This is something I don't particularly like. Hidden Stockpiles feels too cute. It's too close. I think this is a card that I really am a fan of, but I just don't think this is the kind of deck for it to work in, and I really don't like this in Commander, because unfortunately it doesn't say any end step, it says your end step. So you will get 1/1/1 every turn cycle, and I just don't think that's good enough. So that one catches my eye. Tenuous Truce is not a card I particularly like. I've played with it quite a bit, and what this reads as is this, right? It is 1 and a white. You and target opponent draw on the end of your opponent's draw step, and your opponent at any time can stop this from happening by attacking you. See, here's the thing. This card works really well politically, but if you are ahead, this card will never ever land. Well, it shouldn't, right? This is like supposed to be a catch-up card, but what's really interesting, it's catch-up for 2 players, and if you cannot get the politics from this card off, you will actually never draw a card. So imagine you're playing with me and 2 other players. You're ahead or close enough to being ahead, that I feel a little unsure about it. You look around, you say, I'm going to cast Tenuous Truce. Does anyone want to enter a truce with me? Nobody really answers. You know, people are neutral about it because they kind of know that you're ahead. You say, well, I'm casting it anyways. I will enchant Curse Deck Builder because, you know, he's the furthest behind. So here's the thing though, right? If I'm very far, even if I'm very far behind, maybe I'll leave it in play for a while. But let's say I don't want you to have this ability anyways. It gets to my turn. I can just attack you, right? When I attack you, because the draw triggers at the end of my end step, on my end step, I can attack you, sacrifice this card, and yeah, you'll draw off of Narci, but you won't get any other cards at all, right? And therefore, in a way, you've paid 2 mana to draw a card, which I think is kind of bad, all things considered, and we can move on. And the thing is, even if that's not ideal, like that's not what's going to happen, and I leave it around for a while, I leave it around until I want it gone, because most likely you don't want it gone, right? And like, maybe there's something to say that you can play this and immediately sacrifice it by attacking an opponent. But I think all of these things make it a borderline playable card as opposed to a particularly good card. I've gotten this card. I've tried to make it work. I really don't like it. You really need the right setup to take advantage of this. And even then, like, the best way to do it is to force a situation where players cannot attack you, even if they wanted to, so that you have complete control over when the truce is destroyed. So I would cut this for sure. Let's see. I always look at Promise of Bunrai, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, and I'm always unsure if I like this, because I feel like I always forget exactly what this card does, where I go, oh, okay. I always think it's like 2 spirits, and it's not. It's 4 1/1s, and I go, wow, that's actually really, really good. And then I remember they don't have flying, and I go, oh, that's actually really, really bad. I don't know if I want 4 1/1 spirits without flying in this deck, especially since we have such few creatures. So if we're losing one of our 16 creatures, we're really losing a creature. And I almost want to cut a creature, which I'll get to in a second. So already we're really, really low. So I think the chances of this actually doing anything isn't very it's not very high. And I think the creature you're losing the most is gonna be Narci. So even then I'm like, Narci won't be able to trigger, because in order for Promise of Bunrai to trigger, which you don't have a choice on, remember, Narci has to die, and if she dies, you won't get the card draw. I just don't see it happening. Let's see if anything else really catches my eye. I think Assemble the Entmoot. I get why this can be really, really good, because Narci's ability works with both ends of it, right? You wait till like Eldest Reborn triggers, and all of a sudden you gain 5 health, you sacrifice this, you draw another card, and then you get 3 5/5s. I think that's rather good, but there's just a lot of situations where this card does nothing. If Narci is constantly pressured off of the battlefield, this card just does nothing. And there might be a situation where you might feel forced to sacrifice this without gaining life so that you can just get the card draw if Narci keeps getting removed. And that's really, really rough. And with that in mind, I would cut this for sure, especially considering the mana cost. But I think the rest are generally good, and I don't have a problem with any of the others. So these are all good. Nyxborn Behemoth. I don't know. I don't like this. I'm personally, in a deck with such few creatures, having one really big beater is rather clumsy, right? Like, don't get me wrong, you do damage, right? You are draining your opponents for 5, 4, 3 damage every few turn cycles, and that's not nothing. And adding that pressure with a 10/10 trample is also not nothing. But it's also just a 10-10 trample, right? You're going to be poking away at your opponents with this, and you won't be really able to back up these attacks with other creatures or to formulate another kind of board. And there might be situations where, like, this creature might have to be played defensively, right? I do like that it has an activated ability to sacrifice other enchantments, which can be really useful with Narci to cycle some enchantments. But I don't know. I personally don't really like it. I don't think it's on theme, so I'll leave it up to you to decide. Let me see if there's anything else. Beseech the Mirror is really neat here. There's probably a lot of different choices of what's the correct one, and I do really like that. And I think it is particularly good. You're also on 33 lands, and I wouldn't mind if you went up 1 or 2 lands. I think that would be particularly nice to at least get to 35. You're really good on mana. You do have a lot of things. You could play a little more, but you have some 1 mana creatures, some 2 mana creatures. I think you're particularly fine with this amount of mana, but I personally would be rather happy if you had, 1 or 2 more lands. I think those are generally the ones that I want. Snow permanent or a legendary card, or a saga, right? I forgot that this gets saga. I was like, this is particularly strange to me. Technically, for what it's worth, you should be playing Snowlands if you're playing for Search for Glory. But, I mean, you can just look at your opponents and say, hey, these are all snow, right? And maybe they'll let you get away with it. I would, but it depends who you're playing with. Otherwise, the deck looks rather good. Though I've given you a lot of cards to think about, I'll round it off by saying the kinds of interactions that I'd like to see, depending on the power level you'd like. Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile are always really easy in these colors. We've got Generous Gift, we've got Stroke of Midnight, we've got Beast Within as a really nice collection of cards that destroy any permanents. We also have Nature's Claim as your enchantment artifact destruction, but I would suggest highly instead to use the Seals because they're more on theme, even if they're more mana. Yeah, I think that's generally it. I don't know if I really want defensive, like Teferi's Protection could be really, really good here. If you are feeling that people are bringing Planar Cleansing or back to nature style effects to destroy all your enchantments, but I think generally you'll be fine. You could play some board clears. I'll leave that up to you to decide. You do have few creatures. Now, you have a few creatures that allow you to go wide, like Arasta or Elish Norn. And I'm going to assume Elish Norn here is here for the Argent Etchings. She's really good, but she's also a little clumsy here. I feel like it's a bit tough to flip her, but she's really cool, and I assume that's why she's here, which is why I haven't said anything. Likewise, actually, Erebros could probably be cut as well. You just don't have a lot of creatures to sacrifice. And so, like, I know Arasta is really, really good here, but you're not always going to have her, so you're not going to always be able to, output tons and tons of spiders. But if you do stick at this kind of level of creatures, you could probably get away with board clears, because a lot of your creatures are really kind of kill on sight. Like if you have a Sithist and Sanctum Weaver board, those creatures are going to be removed. And once they're removed, your board clears are just upside. So it might be worth playing 1 or 2. I'll leave that for you to decide. We do have a lot of tokens actually from here. Do I still want to cut that if we have a lot? I still want to cut Erebros. It's either Erebros or Elish Norn. Erebros at least has, I'd say Elish Norn is probably a bit better because at least you can interact with her main ability, and a 3/5 is pretty strong. Whereas Erebros completely needs you to have creatures to do anything, and there's just going to be some boards where you don't have creatures, even with all your token generation, right? I think that's generally it. I think those are generally my thoughts. I think I'd really like to see the next draft of this because there is a lot to cut to put in extra cards, and we do need some interaction. So we are looking at quite a few cuts, which I would consider to change the deck by quite a high means. 3 visits. We have Sylvian Scrying. What is this grabbing? I guess Urza's Saga. What is Urza's Saga grabbing? I guess Soul Ring. I like Sylvan Scrying a lot more with the knowledge that we're going to put in Hall of Helioid's Generosity, but Urza's Saga can only grab Soul Ring. I wouldn't mind a second card. I don't know what that is right now. Maybe like a Traveler's Amulet. What is the kind of card? I can't remember right now, but there are some 1-mana cards that can get you lands and things like that. Or Shadow Spear could be an option, or Pithing Needle even could be fine in something like this. I just wouldn't mind a second ability, a second card to grab outside of Soul Ring. Because if you have both in your hand, like, okay, whatever, what can you do? But Soul Ring is a card that, like, you know, sometimes just doesn't cut it. And I would like a second choice off of Saga. Or if you draw the Soul Ring, the fact that Saga's third mode just doesn't do anything is kind of a bummer. But yeah, I do particularly like this. I'm excited to see what's going to happen here. And I do want to see the next draft. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, I'd love to see it. There is a link in the video description below. And if you would like that deck to also be brought up to the front of a list, there is a link there too. As always, if you like, comment, subscribe, I'd be very, very gracious. It helps build the channel, and I do really appreciate it. Narci is a really, really cool commander. Thank you so much for sending it, Lexa. I've been thinking about Narci and Anakthea for a while now. I've just been immediately kind of taken aback by the 2 enchantment decks that came out right back to back. So I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with that. And so I'm glad that you sent me this deck so I could have a chance to kind of whet my appetite for it. I think she's really cool. I think she's, especially when we just had a 5-color Saga commander, I prefer her quite a bit because I don't like 5-color tribal decks. And so, like, having some restriction is good. And Narci brings, I think, reasonable restrictions to the deck. Her abilities are a little strange, I think, sometimes, but I think the ceiling is actually really, really high. Especially as Narci mentioned in their message, Lexa mentioned in their message to me, there is like a Yenna combo with, where is our card, 3 Blind Mice, where you can create copies, token copies of cards, especially token copies of 3 Blind Mice, and then the 2 and 3 starts making more copies of that card, and then what's its name again? And then Yenna makes copies of other sagas, so you can kind of go off like that. And I almost want to see a Yenna deck that's built around that idea of using Yenna and 3 Blind Mice. If only she had blue. If she had blue, we could make copies of our token copies of our sagas. But I think there's something there, and I would love to see a Yenna deck. But even here, I think with Narci's ability to have multiple sagas going off in the same turn, you can probably drain a lot of mana. So I think there is a build of this deck that's a lot more defensive and more of a combo style deck where you're just trying to set up an interaction that just goes off. But I'm not quite sure what that looks like. But this is on my mind. Thank you so much for sending the deck, Lexa. And I hope the things I've said have been helpful. And I look forward for another draft of the deck. All right, good luck.